He thought his life had been shattered since the day his wife died, since he had to sleep in an old car with his loyal German shepherd. But then one afternoon, fate led him to a strangely tilted house on the edge of the Colorado woods, a house that stood precariously, as if someone had pushed it sideways, surviving for nearly 7 decades without falling. People said it was useless. People told him not to come near it. But when he opened the iron door at the end of the hallway, a door locked with a cold iron lock that seemed to have been waiting for him for a long time, he understood why the whole house was leaning to one side, because what lay inside was so heavy that it could bring down a person's life. And from that moment on, there was no turning back for him and his dog. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Warm summer air trembled above the dusty Colorado highway, carrying the scent of sagebrush and loneliness. Thomas Hale gripped the steering wheel of the battered pickup truck as if holding on to the last solid thing in his life. At 55, he had the build of a man once carved from discipline. Broad shoulders, sinewed arms, a square jaw hardened by both military years and the quiet storms no one else ever saw. His short brown hair was beginning to gray at the temples, and the neatly trimmed beard he once kept sharp during deployment now grew uneven from weeks of sleeping in the truck. Deep lines bracketed his eyes, signs of nights spent awake replaying memories he wished he could bury. Losing his wife had broken something deep inside him, and the fracture had not healed. It had only spread like cracks spidering across glass. Beside him lay Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, a strong male with a black saddle across his back, deep amber eyes, and ears that twitched at every shifting sound outside. Ranger wasn't just a dog, he was the last living thread tying Thomas to the version of himself that had once laughed easily and believed in a future worth planning. Ranger had been a therapy dog assigned to him during his final year of service, but somewhere between long marches and quiet nights under desert skies, the two grew inseparable. When Thomas lost Elena, the one woman whose voice could ground him, Ranger simply moved closer, as if understanding that his role had suddenly doubled. Durango had once been home, a place of mountain silhouettes and memories built from the soft glow of convenience store coffee, shared late-night drives with Elena, and the hopeful plans of two people who loved, quietly but fiercely. But everything shattered the day she died, hit by a truck whose driver fell asleep at the wheel while hurrying to the airport to pick him up. Thomas carried that guilt like a weight stitched into his bones. After the funeral, sleep became a stranger. Job interviews felt like interrogations. He was doomed to fail. His savings evaporated, the mortgage slipped beyond reach, and when the bank finally claimed the house he once painted with Elena, he didn't fight. He didn't have the strength to. So, he and Ranger lived in the pickup, an aging silver Ford with peeling paint and a cracked dashboard. He parked behind the old feed store most nights, where nobody bothered him. He told himself it was temporary, just until he could stand again. But every sunrise felt heavier, and the idea of starting over became something distant, like a language he once spoke but had forgotten. One sweltering afternoon, when the heat pressed so fiercely it felt like it could bend metal, Thomas stopped at a local gas station to rest his eyes. That was where he met Nora Whitford, first only as a voice behind him asking, "Do you know how to fix irrigation pumps?" He turned to find a woman in her late 70s, thin, upright despite age, her posture shaped by a life of discipline and quiet authority. Her silver hair was tied in a loose bun, revealing a long, elegant face, etched with the calm confidence of someone who had worked hard enough to afford serenity. Her clothes were simple but carefully chosen, a cream cardigan and dark slacks, dusted lightly with soil at the hems. Her gray eyes carried a sharpness that suggested she saw more than most, especially when they paused on Ranger, then flicked back to the weary slump in Thomas's shoulders. She owned land on the northern hills of Durango, a place people spoke about with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Her late husband had left her the Whitford orchard, though rumor said she rarely let anyone in after he died. The townsfolk described her as private, sometimes stern but fair, a woman whose past held more sorrow than she ever admitted aloud. When Thomas said he knew his way around pumps, she studied him in silence long enough to make him shift uneasily. Then she simply nodded and said, "Come with me, it's work, not much pay, but it's honest." That was how he ended up at the Whitford property a few hours later, cleaning debris from a clogged water line while Ranger sniffed around the rows of apple trees. Thomas worked quietly, methodically, the way he had been trained to. Nora watched from the shade of her porch, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she invited him inside for lemonade. The house smelled of cedarwood and old books. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly, eyes sharp with a kind of perceptive sympathy he rarely saw in others. "You're carrying something heavy," she said plainly, not unkindly. Thomas lowered his gaze. "Everyone carries something." "Yes," she replied, "but not everyone's weight bends the air around them." She asked where he lived. He hesitated, then admitted the truth. A flicker, almost sorrow, crossed her face. "Then you should not sleep in that truck another night." He looked up sharply. "Ma'am, I don't accept charity." "This isn't charity," she said, her tone firm yet strangely gentle. "I have a house I no longer use. A crooked thing at the forest's edge, old but standing. I want someone trustworthy to take care of it." "A house?" She nodded once. "It has stood nearly 70 years. Leaning, yes, but not fallen." Thomas felt something shift inside him. Wariness, gratitude, fear of hope itself. Why him? Why now? Why that house? Nora didn't explain. She only slid a small brass key across the table, and as Thomas picked it up, a strange shiver ran through him, like the first hint of something waiting far beyond the trees. The crooked house waited at the edge of the forest like something holding its breath, its wooden frame leaning so sharply westward that Thomas Hale half expected the entire structure to sigh and collapse as he stepped out of the pickup. The late afternoon light threw long amber streaks across the clearing, brushing the crooked roof with a molten glow that felt both warm and unsettling. Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd with the thick black saddle and vigilant amber eyes, hopped out first, sniffing the ground with the bristling alertness of a creature who sensed that something about this place had been left untouched for too long. Thomas approached slowly, each step on the uneven porch creaking under his weight. His boots were worn, his jeans smudged with dirt from too many nights spent curled on the seat of the pickup. His breath caught as he pushed the door open. The interior smelled of old timber ridden with time, damp wood, dust, and the faint sweetness of something organic decaying far beneath the floorboards. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the warped walls, casting fractured patterns across a long corridor that slanted in perfect mimicry of the entire structure. Ranger stood stiff at Thomas's leg, his tail low, his ears pricked forward. He growled with a low, steady rumble the moment his gaze reached the end of the hallway. Thomas followed the direction of his stare. There, framed by the leaning walls, was a thick iron door bolted into the far end. It did not belong to any ordinary house. Heavy rivets studded its edges. The lock, an oversized rusted steel block, hung from a chain like a clenched fist, and above it, carved faintly into the warped wooden frame, someone had etched a sentence worn soft by time. "The price of trust is its keeping." The word sent a chill through Thomas's chest, deeper than the forest wind that slipped through the roof. He stepped closer, brushing dust off the letters with the edge of his sleeve. Ranger pressed his nose forward but backed away suddenly, the hair along his spine lifting in a sharp ridge. Thomas frowned as the dog growled again, a sound that trembled with warning rather than fear. When he laid his palm on the iron surface, it felt colder than it should have been. Cold like metal untouched by sunlight for years. Cold like something hiding a truth beneath it. As he explored the rest of the house, he noticed the wooden beams bending under uneven weight, the floorboards slanting enough that a marble would roll across the room on its own. A narrow kitchen tucked beneath a tilted ceiling held rusted kettles and chipped plates that looked as if someone had set them down one day and simply never returned. A small bedroom near the back contained an iron bed frame tilted so dramatically that the mattress had slid partially off. A moth-eaten blanket lay curled in a corner like a forgotten memory. Thomas imagined someone living here long ago, perhaps holding a secret they didn't dare share, perhaps guarding something too heavy for one life alone. Ranger refused to enter the bedroom, choosing instead to sit at the edge of the hall where he kept the iron door within sight. Thomas tried coaxing him, but Ranger remained rigid, his amber eyes fixed, unblinking. He had acted skittish in combat zones before, always correctly, but this was different. This was instinct, the old kind, the kind animals trusted when humans talked themselves out of fear. Outside, a pickup engine cut through the quiet. Thomas stepped to the window and saw a man climb out, his first visitor here. It was Caleb Ortiz, a neighbor from a ranch 2 miles south. Caleb was in his early 40s, tall but slightly stooped from years of manual labor. with sunburned skin the color of warm clay and a thick mustache hiding most of his upper lip. His hair, dark and curling near the ears, was tied back loosely with a piece of leather cord. Caleb was known in the region for being helpful yet cautious, traits shaped after losing his brother in a hunting accident years earlier, an event that left him speaking in slow, deliberate tones as if every word cost him something. He lifted a hand in greeting. "You must be the new caretaker Nora mentioned," he said, his voice gravelly but polite. Thomas returned the nod. "Trying to be," he answered. Caleb glanced toward the crooked roof. "Strange old place. My father used to say the house leaned because it was tired of standing alone." He chuckled softly, then added, "If you need tools or help patching anything, come by. The woods can be unpredictable." Ranger sniffed the air cautiously. Caleb watched the dog carefully but respectfully, offering a small nod as if acknowledging another creature with scars of its own. When Caleb left, the clearing fell into silence again, deeper now, as though the world had stepped back to watch what Thomas would do next. That night, with the sun gone and the forest breathing cool shadows into the crooked house, Thomas lay on an old cot he dragged near the back room, far away from the iron door. Ranger curled beside him, muscles tense even in sleep. Outside, crickets sang in rhythmic pulses, but inside, the air felt heavier, like the house itself was holding a story too old and too heavy to stay quiet. Then, sometime past midnight, a faint metallic sound drifted through the hallway. It wasn't the creak of floorboards shifting or nails settling. It was a low, dragging scrape, metal against metal, slow and deliberate, like something shifting behind the iron door after years of silence. Ranger bolted upright, teeth bared, staring into the dark hall as if waiting for something to emerge. Thomas held his breath. The sound came again, and in that moment, he realized the crooked house was not nearly as empty as it seemed. Morning light pushed through the slanted windows in pale ribbons, flickering as branches swayed outside. Thomas Hale had barely slept. Every time he drifted close to rest, he heard again that faint metallic scrape from the iron door, the noise that felt too intentional to be the house settling. Ranger had remained awake too, ears alert, watching the hallway as if standing guard over something Thomas wasn't yet ready to face. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. A silver sedan rolled up the path, clean, polished, and startlingly out of place beside the crooked house. When the door opened, Nora Whitford stepped out with the same quiet authority she carried the day before. Today she wore a long charcoal gray coat that softened the angles of her aging frame. Her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her head, revealing high cheekbones and a thin mouth that rarely smiled but never seemed cruel. There was dignity in her posture, the kind shaped by decades of holding her family and her land together through storms, both literal and emotional. Thomas stepped outside to meet her. She studied his face first, then glanced down at Ranger, who remained close at his leg, tail stiff, gaze fixed on Nora as though reading something in the air around her. "You didn't sleep," Nora said, not as a question but a quiet conclusion. "No," Thomas admitted. "There were noises." A flicker crossed her expression, so brief he wondered if he imagined it. She followed him into the house, her gaze sweeping the slanted walls as though greeting an old memory. When her eyes found the iron door at the end of the hall, she paused. The lines on her face deepened, but not from anger or fear, more like the weight of recognition. Thomas did not wait. "Why did you give me this house, Nora?" She turned toward him, her gray eyes steady. Up close, he saw the fine network of wrinkles at the corners, etched by years of worry rather than laughter. "Because this house needs someone who understands loss," she said softly. "Someone who won't try to take more than it offers." "That's not an answer," Thomas replied. "And there's something behind that door." Nora's gaze slid back to the iron door, lingering there as though it were a grave she had tended for far too long. When she looked at him again, her voice softened in a way he hadn't heard before. "Thomas, some things survive only because they were kept from people who would destroy them, and some secrets become heavy with time, too heavy for the wrong hands." Her hand dipped into her coat pocket. When she pulled it out, she held a small brass key, its metal dulled but well cared for. She studied it a long moment, as though saying goodbye, then placed it into Thomas's palm. Her fingers were cold. "You will know when you're ready," she said. "And when you are, remember this. What lies behind that door isn't for the greedy. It demands restraint." Thomas stared at the key, its weight far greater than its size. What exactly is back there? Nora did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between them until Ranger broke it with a low rumble from deep in his chest. Finally, Nora spoke. A legacy my family couldn't protect. Something that cost more than you can imagine. She stepped away from the hallway and moved toward the kitchen, where the floor slanted sharply downward. Her movements were slow, careful. Not because she was weak, but because she seemed to feel every creak in the structure more intimately than he did. Please, Thomas said quietly. If I'm to stay here, I need to know. Nora looked up, and for the first time he saw not the composed widow, but a woman carrying grief that never learned how to fade. My father trusted the wrong man, she said, her voice trembling slightly. My brothers demanded what they didn't earn. My husband tried to fix what they broke. In the end, the house was the only thing strong enough to hold what remained. Before Thomas could ask more, another vehicle appeared on the road, a boxy green SUV coated with dust. A woman stepped out, tall and lean, her stride sharp with urgency. She had tightly curled auburn hair, pulled back under a faded baseball cap, fair skin freckled by years of outdoor work, and brown eyes that scanned the clearing in quick assessing sweeps. This was Deputy Marlene Shaw, one of the local sheriff's officers. She was in her early 40s, known for being direct and fiercely protective of the Foothill residents. Her temper had grown shorter after nearly losing her partner in a wildfire 3 years ago, a trauma that left her with an instinctive vigilance in every new place she walked into. She approached with a curt nod. Nora, I heard your car and figured you'd be up here. Everything all right? Nora offered a polite smile, though tension flickered beneath it. Just checking on the house and its new caretaker. Deputy Shaw looked at Thomas and Ranger. Welcome to the hills. Strange place for a first night. Her gaze lingered on the crooked roof. These old houses have their stories. Thomas forced a small nod. I'm starting to see that. Shaw studied him a moment longer before turning to Nora. You sure he's the right one? Nora's answer was simple. Yes. Something unspoken passed between the two women, an understanding, a shared knowledge of dangers neither felt comfortable explaining in front of him. After Shaw left, Nora placed a gentle but firm hand on Thomas's arm. Whatever you hear, whatever you think you see, do not speak of this place to my family. Not one word. Why? What would they do? Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. They would take what they believe is theirs, and they would tear you apart to do it. A cold wind swept through the crooked house, rattling the iron door. Nora stepped outside, pausing on the porch before leaving. Be careful tonight, Thomas. The house listens, and sometimes it remembers. He watched her leave, the key heavy in his hand, Ranger standing rigid beside him. For the first time, Thomas wondered whether the thing behind the iron door was waiting for him, or warning him. Wind lashed against the crooked house like a furious animal, rattling loose shingles and tugging at the warped boards as thunder rolled along the Durango foothills. Thomas Hale braced the front door shut with his shoulder, water seeping through gaps where the frame had long surrendered to time. Ranger paced in tight, anxious circles, his black saddle bristling each time lightning flashed through the slanted windows. When a sudden gust tore away a corner of the roof, rain spilled through the opening in steady, cold rivulets. Thomas exhaled sharply. He didn't have much time before the entire room was soaked. He needed tools, patches, tarp, anything. And he remembered Nora telling him the house stored plenty of old equipment if one knew where to look. His eyes drifted toward the end of the crooked hallway, toward the iron door. Ranger froze at the same moment, as if he sensed the direction of Thomas's thoughts. His paws planted firmly, chest rising and falling, with rapid, uneasy breaths. Thomas knelt and ran a calming hand along the dog's neck, feeling the taut tremor of muscle beneath the fur. I know, boy, he murmured, but we don't have a choice tonight. Ranger whined, a soft, reluctant sound. But when Thomas stood, gripping the small brass key Nora had given him, the dog followed, close enough that his warm breath hit the back of Thomas's leg with each step. The hallway felt narrower than before, as if the house itself leaned further into its perpetual tilt. The air near the iron door was colder, stagnant, carrying a metallic tang like old coins and damp earth. Thomas fitted the key into the lock, surprised by how smoothly it turned despite its age. With a heavy groan, the steel door loosened and swung inward. A draft of cool air brushed his face, air untouched by decades of seasons outside. Ranger tensed, but he did not back away. Thomas stepped inside and froze. What he had expected to be a small storage closet instead opened into a wide stone staircase spiraling deep into the ground. The steps were carved from the same type of granite that formed the cliffs north of town. Thick, ancient, expertly worked. Lantern brackets lined the walls, holding corroded metal lamps that must have belonged to another century. The deeper he descended, the colder the air became, and the more Ranger pressed against him as if urging caution. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow corridor widened into a cavernous room reinforced with timber beams blackened by age. Thomas lifted his flashlight. The beams swept across shapes, massive wooden chests stacked atop one another, iron crates sealed with old padlocks, and long metal shelves sagging under the weight of items wrapped in canvas and burlap. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, tapping rhythmically onto the stone floor like a heartbeat slowed but persistent. Ranger sniffed at the nearest chest, then stepped back, sneezing as dust billowed up. Thomas approached a wooden trunk. The latch crumbled with a soft snap when he lifted it. Inside, beneath layers of linen, lay rows of silverware, delicate filigree bowls, chalices engraved with mountain patterns, forks and knives crafted with meticulous artistry. They gleamed under the beam of the flashlight, despite decades hidden away. Each piece bore the same elegant marking, a W, carved in looping script at the base. He opened another chest. This one held rolls of thick parchment, maps drawn with ink now browned by time. Mountain ridges, native trails, notes in handwriting that slanted confidently, as though the writer never doubted where each path led. He recognized one map immediately, the original layout of Durango during its earliest mining years, a piece historians claimed had been lost in a courthouse fire. Thomas's breath shortened as he moved to the next container. This chest was heavier, the metal hinges resisting, until he pried them open with a rusty crowbar left leaning against a beam. Inside lay coins, hundreds, possibly thousands, stacked in leather pouches that had begun to crack along the seams. Gold dollars from the frontier era, stamped with dates belonging to the earliest miners. Enough to buy not just a life, but several. Ranger backed up, gaze fixed toward the far corner. Thomas followed the dog's line of sight, and his flashlight revealed stacks of long, rectangular silver ingots, each one stamped with the Whitford crest. Dozens of bars, maybe more. Enough weight to physically tilt a structure, enough value to destroy a family, and then it hit him. The house wasn't leaning because of age. It was leaning because everything inside this hidden chamber, all this wealth, had pulled its bones down inch by inch, decade after decade. He turned slowly, the scope of the discovery burying him beneath a swell of disbelief, awe, and a prickling unease. Every item bore the Whitford initial, a signature of a family once wealthy enough to dictate the flow of trade in the region. But their empire collapsed after a vicious inheritance dispute. Rumors had whispered it for years. Greed had splintered the family, left wounds that time refused to close. Now here he stood in the middle of the truth they had buried. Ranger let out a low, uneasy bark. Thomas kneeled beside him, placing a steadying hand on the dog's shoulder. He could almost hear Nora's voice in the back of his mind. It isn't for the greedy. But a new thought crept in, unwanted yet insistent. If this treasure existed, others must have searched for it. Others might still be searching. Lightning cracked overhead. Dust rained from the beams. Thomas suddenly felt the depth of the chamber, the weight of the secrets around him, and the invisible eyes of a family that would do anything to reclaim what they believed was theirs. And in the silence that followed, he realized something else. This discovery had not just changed what he knew about the house. It had changed what the house now knew about him. The storm had passed, but the air still tasted of rain and unsettled earth. Thomas Hale lay awake long after midnight, listening to the steady breathing of Ranger curled beside the cot. Ever since he opened the underground chamber, sleep had become something fragile, an uncertain thing that slipped away at the smallest noise. The crooked house groaned softly as winds drifted through warped beams, and Thomas kept imagining the weight beneath the floor shifting, as if the treasure itself remembered his touch. Rumors often traveled faster than truth in small towns. Over the past few days, Thomas noticed glances that lingered too long at the hardware store, whispers that cut off when he walked past the diner, and a subtle but unmistakable tension each time the Whitford name was mentioned. Ranger, normally calm, had begun reacting to scents in the forest with a sharp vigilance Thomas did not ignore. The dog had spent hours standing at the porch edge, fur bristling, gaze locked on the tree line. That evening, just after the last traces of dusk faded into the dark, Thomas caught sight of someone watching him from the road below, a young man leaning against a black SUV. The man was tall and wiry, with short sandy blonde hair and a narrow face dominated by intense blue eyes. His name, Thomas soon learned, was Brandon Whitford, the youngest of Nora's nephews. Brandon's reputation preceded him: clever, ambitious, and entitled, shaped by growing up in a wealthy family while always believing he deserved more. He glanced at the house with open contempt before driving away without a word. The next afternoon brought another visitor. Andrew Whitford, Nora's middle nephew, appeared leaning against the hood of a pristine white truck. Andrew was in his early 40s, stockier than Brandon, with dark slicked-back hair, a trimmed goatee, and the self-assurance of a man used to negotiating deals that favored him alone. He had the build of someone who exercised more for appearance than discipline, and he spoke with a smooth confidence that bordered on arrogance. He introduced himself politely, but the smile he offered did not reach his eyes. Only hours later, the third nephew arrived. Lucas Whitford, the eldest, climbed out of a luxury sedan and approached with a stiffness that suggested both pride and resentment. Lucas was in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with silvering hair combed severely back and a stern face that rarely softened. Years of managing failing family businesses had carved deep lines into his forehead, giving him a permanent look of controlled frustration. He asked a series of pointed questions about why Thomas lived there and what arrangement Nora had made. It was clear the nephews were circling, watching, calculating. That night, just past 2 a.m, Thomas woke to Ranger's sudden bark, a sharp, violent sound that sprang from deep instinct. Before Thomas could rise, Ranger charged toward the door. Through the slanted window, Thomas saw twin beams of headlights creeping along the dirt road, then stopping abruptly at the edge of the forest. Doors slammed, voices carried through the night, low and hurried. Thomas's pulse hammered. He grabbed his jacket and stepped onto the porch where the cold air hit him like a slap. 4 figures moved at the tree line. 3 he recognized even in silhouette: Brandon, Andrew, and Lucas. The 4th was a broader man carrying a heavy metal cutter slung over one shoulder. His name, Thomas later confirmed, was Steve Marlowe, a local welder known for taking under-the-table jobs. Steve was in his late 30s, burly and unshaven, with a shaved head and a coarse beard that shadowed his square jaw. His reputation wasn't polished. He'd been in and out of trouble for bar fights and debt, and his blunt-tempered personality made him easy to manipulate with money. They moved together toward the back of the house. Ranger snarled fiercely, tugging against Thomas's grip. Thomas tried dialing Deputy Shaw, but the phone only clicked uselessly. No signal. The storm had knocked the tower out again. He was alone. He needed time. Thomas sprinted to the pickup and slammed his fist onto the horn. The blaring sound shattered the quiet forest, while he flipped every switch inside the crooked house, lights bursting through windows like a beacon. Ranger raced around the property, barking with wild intensity, lunging toward the intruders before circling back to Thomas, as if helping him build the illusion of more people inside. In the distance, he heard Brandon shout, "There's no one else! Keep cutting!" The 4 men moved faster. Steve revved the cutter, metal grinding violently as sparks began flying from the back wall, the exact spot that hid the underground chamber. Thomas grabbed a rusted shovel from the porch and ran toward them, despite knowing he stood no chance against 4 determined men. Ranger charged beside him, barking so aggressively that even Steve flinched. Andrew swung around with a flashlight, yelling, "Back off, old man! This isn't your property!" "You don't know what you're doing," Thomas warned, breath ragged. "Walk away!" Lucas stepped forward, eyes gleaming with something dark and obsessive. "Everything in that house belongs to us, and we will take it tonight." Before Thomas could respond, a new sound cut through the forest, the roar of an engine approaching at full speed. Headlights sliced across the clearing. A truck barreled down the dirt path, tires spitting gravel like sparks. It skidded to a stop just feet away, and the driver's door swung open with force. Nora Whitford stepped out. Behind her were 2 forest rangers armed with high-powered flashlights and protective gear. One was Ranger Officer Bill Hanley, a tall, broad man in his 50s, with graying sideburns, weathered skin, and a calm authority shaped from decades patrolling the mountains. The other was Officer Denise Calloway, a younger ranger with dark braided hair, lean, athletic build, and sharp brown eyes honed from rescue operations. Nora's voice cut through the dark, with a cold, unwavering edge Thomas had never heard from her. "Drop everything," she commanded. "Now!" The nephews froze. Steve lowered the cutter. and for the first time, Thomas saw not a widow, but the fierce matriarch of a fractured dynasty, standing like a judge before the legacy she had fought her whole life to protect. The forest fell silent. The only sound was Ranger's growl, low and steady, as though warning the night itself that this was far from over. Morning settled over the forest with a softness Thomas Hale had not felt in years. Mist drifted between the pines, curling into thin threads around the crooked house, as if the trees themselves were whispering relief. The intruders had been taken into custody hours earlier, and Ranger, exhausted but triumphant, slept curled near the repaired front door. Thomas stood on the leaning porch, the cold boards beneath his boots catching faint glimmers of sunlight that slipped through the clouds. He didn't feel victorious. He felt changed. Nora Whitford arrived just after sunrise in the same charcoal gray coat she had worn the day before, but today she looked smaller somehow, not weak, but unburdened, as though the confrontation had peeled away a layer she had carried too long. Deep lines of age etched her face, but her eyes held clarity. The kind that came only after a decision long deferred finally found its moment. She stepped onto the porch with careful grace and rested her gloved hand on the railing. "Thomas," she said, voice gentle but weighted, "we need to speak somewhere quiet." They sat inside the crooked house, where Nora glanced around the slanted room, as though reflecting on every memory contained in its uneven walls. Ranger awoke and moved to sit beside her, leaning the weight of his warm body against her leg. She stroked his head absently, her touch soft but trembling. "There is something you must know," she began. "Something I have kept hidden longer than I should have." Thomas leaned forward, sensing the gravity in her tone. Nora inhaled deeply, then continued. "The treasure beneath this house. It was never meant for anyone in my family, not even me." Her voice thinned. "It belonged to my grandfather, a man both brilliant and cruel. When disputes over inheritance tore the Whitfords apart, he hid the fortune so no heir could destroy the others fighting for it. My father found the chamber after the old man's death, but swore to protect it, until a time when someone worthy appeared." Thomas listened without blinking, absorbing every word. "When my father passed," she said, "I became the keeper. I guarded it for nearly 40 years. My brothers demanded it. My nephews schemed for it, but none understood what it truly represented." Her eyes met Thomas's, unwavering. "Loss teaches a person what matters. Responsibility teaches what must be preserved. You know both." Thomas felt the air shift. His throat tightened. "When your wife died, I saw a man who broke, but did not surrender," Nora said softly. "And when you lost your home, you protected your dog before you protected yourself. That is the kind of loyalty the treasure requires." She drew a thin envelope from her coat. The paper was worn, creased at the edges. She placed it in Thomas's hand. "My new will," she said, "signed yesterday. The entire property, the house, and the contents of the underground chamber are now yours." Thomas froze, the envelope heavy as stone. "Nora, I can't accept—" "You can," she interrupted gently, "because I have chosen you, and because you will not misuse what has cost my family so much." He looked down, overwhelmed. Ranger nudged his arm, letting out a soft rumble, as if urging him to breathe. Nora offered a faint smile. "I ask only one thing. Protect it. Not with guns, not with gates, but with purpose." And he knew exactly what she meant. Weeks passed. Summer burned into autumn, the trees shedding their colors like quiet confessions. With a portion of the gold and silver, just enough, Thomas began rebuilding the crooked house. Craftsmen from town arrived, including Eli Turner, a carpenter in his 60s, with a rugged frame, white stubble, sunburned skin, and hands permanently scarred from decades of labor. Eli had a reputation for being blunt, but his craftsmanship was unmatched. He moved through the house with reverence, running his fingers along beams and muttering about history living in wood. His practical, straightforward nature anchored the reconstruction. A stonemason named Ruth Delgado joined him. Ruth was a sturdy woman in her late 50s, with salt and pepper hair tied in a low braid, warm brown skin, and deep-set hazel eyes. She spoke little, but possessed a steady patience forged through years repairing old mountain cabins. She admired Thomas's resolve, though she rarely said so aloud. Together they straightened the leaning frame, reinforced the foundation, sealed the roof, and polished the interior without disturbing the essence of the home. By winter's first frost, the crooked house stood not perfectly straight, but proudly balanced, its past and present meeting at a new center. With the remaining funds, Thomas formed the Hale Veteran Trust, a charity supporting homeless veterans in Durango and nearby counties. He collaborated with local nonprofits, donating supplies, sponsoring counseling services, and offering transitional housing to those in need. Word spread quickly. Volunteers arrived, donations followed. In the front room of the revived house, Thomas built a modest exhibition space. Not a museum, something humbler. A heritage gallery showcasing military artifacts, letters, and stories contributed by veterans and their families. Every entry was presented with care, a testament to lives shaped by service rather than wealth. And Ranger, faithful Ranger, became a familiar figure in the gallery. His amber eyes greeted every visitor, his calm presence comforting those who carried invisible wounds. Children adored him. Veterans trusted him. He seemed to understand he was no longer guarding Thomas from darkness, but guarding the light they built together. One evening, as Thomas stood on the porch with Ranger lying at his feet, he watched the forest sway in the fading amber light. The crooked house no longer felt like a burden someone handed him in desperation. It felt like a beginning. Some treasures, he realized, were never meant to be hoarded. They were meant to reshape the hands willing to carry them. And as Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking toward the woods as though listening to the breath of a new life settling around them, Thomas finally felt something he thought he had lost forever: home. In the quiet that followed the storm, Thomas often stood on the porch of the once crooked house and thought about how unlikely the journey had been. A grieving man with nothing left, a loyal dog who never stopped believing in him, and a treasure hidden so deep it survived generations of greed. Some people would call it coincidence, but others might call it something closer to a miracle, because sometimes God doesn't speak through thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes he speaks through the small things: a door that finally opens, a loyal companion who refuses to leave your side, or a stranger who unexpectedly reaches out a hand at the moment you need it most. And maybe that is the reminder we all carry into our own days, that even when life leans and threatens to fall, God can rebuild what was broken, that even in loneliness, he can send us someone to walk beside us, and that hope can arrive quietly, just like the light returning to a tilted house no one believed could stand again. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder that they are not alone. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, or share a moment in your life when God sent you help in unexpected ways. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the next story meant to lift your spirit and strengthen your faith. May God bless you, guide you, and keep you safe, today, and in every step you take after this.